The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly over the cracked earth of Cora Abernathy's homestead, its heat shimmering like liquid fire across the barren landscape that stretched endlessly toward the purple shadows of the Dragoon Mountains. At 22, she had known 15 years of absolute crushing solitude. 15 long years since the fever had claimed both her parents in the space of a single terrible week, leaving her the sole guardian of 100 acres of unforgiving desert, and a determination forged in the crucible of isolation. Her world consisted of precisely 3 things: a sturdy log cabin built by hands she could barely remember a precious spring, and that defied every drought and sustained life in this wasteland, and the silent, watchful company of mountains that had witnessed her transformation from a frightened 7-year-old girl into a woman harder than the desert stone itself. The solitude had become her second skin, a fortress built brick by brick against memories too painful to revisit and a future too uncertain to contemplate. But on this particular Tuesday morning in August, choked by the breathless, suffocating heat that made the very air shimmer with malevolent intensity, that fortress would crumble like sand. 7 shadows fell across her land, vast, silent, and utterly impossibly unexpected. Cora's calloused hand froze mid-swing as her axe blade bit deep into the last piece of split oak, the sharp crack echoing across the valley like a gunshot. The familiar rhythm of her morning chores, splitting firewood, hauling water, tending the stubborn vegetables that somehow survived in this harsh soil, had been her lifeline for 15 years, the steady beat that kept madness at bay. But now everything was wrong. The usual chatter of sparrows in the ancient cottonwood by the spring had ceased, leaving only an ominous silence that made her skin crawl. Even the ever-present desert wind, which had been her constant companion through countless lonely days and longer nights, held its breath as if the very land was waiting for something momentous to unfold. Her pale blue eyes, bleached nearly colorless by years of squinting against the relentless Arizona glare, swept the western ridge that formed a natural wall around her small valley. These eyes had seen rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of her porch, mountain lions stalking her mules, and desperate prospectors driven mad by gold fever and the killing heat. But they had never seen anything like what appeared before her now. At first there was only the familiar shimmer of heat rising from sun-baked sandstone, the rocks glowing like coals in a forge. Then, as if summoned by some ancient magic, they materialized from the landscape itself, 7 figures on powerful paint ponies, cresting the ridge in a single perfectly disciplined line that spoke of military precision and deadly purpose. These were not the desperate prospectors who occasionally stumbled upon her land with their empty canteens and wild eyes begging for water before disappearing back into the desert. These were not the Mexican bandits who sometimes crossed the border to raid isolated homesteads, leaving behind only ashes and grief. These were Chiricahua Apache warriors, legends made flesh titans of the desert, whose very presence commanded both fear and respect throughout the entire Arizona territory. The lead rider was a giant among men, broader and taller than anyone Cora had encountered in her rare, necessary trips to the nearest settlement of Redemption Gulch. His massive frame seemed carved from the living rock of the mountains themselves, all flowing muscle and controlled power. His long black hair, gleaming like polished obsidian in the brutal sunlight, was held back by a simple beaded band that caught the light with every slight movement of his head. His chest was bare, except for a leather vest decorated with intricate beadwork, and the bronze skin gleaming with a light sheen of perspiration that spoke of hard riding in the merciless heat. His powerful legs, encased in fringed buckskin leggings, gripped his horse with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle. Each warrior carried a rifle. She could see the deadly gleam of metal, even at this distance, held across his lap, with practiced ease, and a bow slung over his shoulder with a quiver full of arrows that could drop a man at 100 yards. But it was their sheer, overwhelming stillness that sent pure liquid adrenaline coursing through Cora's veins like wildfire. They sat their horses with the patience of stones, the discipline of men who could wait for days without moving if necessary. and the quiet confidence of apex predators who had never encountered anything they couldn't kill. Her hand moved instinctively to the worn walnut grip of her Colt Peacemaker. The weight of the .45 caliber revolver, a familiar comfort against the sudden terror that clawed at her chest with icy fingers. The gun had been her father's Orrin Abernathy, a man of few words but infinite patience, who had taught her to shoot straight and true before the fever took him and her gentle mother, leaving their young daughter alone in this unforgiving wilderness. Panic is a luxury you can't afford out here, little dove. Her father had told her during those long-ago shooting lessons, his weathered hands guiding hers as she learned to squeeze the trigger without jerking the barrel. Keep your head, trust your training, and you'll live to see another sunrise. She didn't run, though every instinct screamed at her to flee to the cabin and bar the door. She stood her ground, feet planted firmly in the red dirt she'd defended alone for 15 years, watching with growing dread as the 7 riders guided their horses down the rocky slope with an effortless grace that belied their massive size. Their ponies' hooves made almost no sound on the hard-packed earth, a silence more unnerving than any war cry, more threatening than any display of weapons. They were death incarnate, moving with the fluid precision of wolves closing in for the kill, and she was alone, helplessly outnumbered with nothing but an old revolver and stubborn pride to protect her. The warriors stopped exactly 50 yards from her cabin, maintaining what seemed a respectful distance, but close enough that she could see every detail of their weapons, their faces, their controlled readiness for violence. It was a calculated distance, far enough to show they weren't immediately threatening, close enough to demonstrate that escape was impossible. The leader dismounted with fluid precision, his movements economical and purposeful, as he handed his reins to the warrior beside him. Up close, he was even more imposing easily, 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could have been hewn from granite and arms corded with muscle, earned through years of warfare and survival in the harshest land on earth. His face appeared carved from the living rock of the mountains themselves, all sharp angles and hard planes, high cheekbones that spoke of noble ancestry, a strong, straight nose that had never been broken, despite what must have been countless battles, and eyes as dark and intense as polished obsidian that seemed to look straight through her defenses to the frightened woman beneath. A single eagle feather adorned his hair, the sacred plume marking him as a war chief, a leader of men who had earned his position through courage, wisdom, and the kind of ruthless competence that kept warriors alive in a world where weakness meant death. He began walking toward her with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and unhurried, a man who had all the time in the world and the patience to use it. Though his hands hung open at his sides in what appeared to be a gesture of peace, the corded muscles in his forearms and the confident way he moved spoke of violence, barely leashed power, held in check only by his iron will. The sight of him approaching this massive, deadly stranger who could snap her neck with his bare hands sent her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She drew her pistol with smooth, practiced motion, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the profound, expectant silence that had settled over her valley like a burial shroud. "That's far enough." She called out, her voice rough from years of disuse, but steady with the resolve her father had beaten into her, along with everything else she'd needed to survive in this wilderness. The words echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to hang in the superheated air like a challenge thrown down between them. The Apache leader stopped immediately, his dark eyes fixed on her with unwavering intensity that made her feel like a specimen pinned to a board. He showed no fear of the weapon pointed at his heart, no surprise at her defiance, only patient, watchful waiting that spoke of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through persistence rather than force. He stood exactly 20 paces away, close enough for her to see the intricate beadwork on his moccasins, geometric patterns in red, blue, and white that told stories she couldn't read, and far enough that he posed no immediate physical threat. It was another calculated distance, she realized, chosen to demonstrate respect while keeping all options open. I have no quarrel with you. Cora continued, her voice gaining strength as her initial terror transformed into the cold, focused anger that had kept her alive through 15 years of solitude. State your business and be on your way. My water is my own, and I'll kill any man who tries to take it. It was always about the water in this thirsty land. Her year-round spring was more precious than gold, more valuable than silver, drawing desperate men like moths to flame. Prospectors had died fighting over claims to streams that ran dry within months. Ranchers had murdered neighbors for access to waterholes. Entire towns had withered and blown away when their wells failed, leaving behind only sun-bleached bones and broken dreams. But this time she was wrong. The Apache leader didn't answer immediately, and the silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. His gaze swept past her with methodical thoroughness, taking in every detail of her hard-won domain and the sturdy cabin with its thick log walls and heavy door designed to withstand both weather and attack the neat stacks of firewood that represented weeks of backbreaking labor, the small but flourishing vegetable garden that testified to her skill and determination, the carefully maintained fence that protected her few chickens from coyotes and foxes. When his eyes returned to hers, she saw something unexpected in their obsidian depths, not the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey, but a deep, ancient gravity that seemed to emanate from his very soul, as if he carried the weight of generations on his broad shoulders. "We haven't come for water," he said at last, his voice a low baritone that seemed to resonate in her bones. Each English word was carefully formed, precisely enunciated, with only the slightest musical accent that spoke of a man who had learned her language well, but had never forgotten his own. "We have not come for war." Cora kept the pistol trained on his chest, though something in his tone, a quality of absolute certainty, of unshakable truth, made her finger ease slightly on the trigger. In 15 years of isolation, she had learned to read men quickly and accurately. Desperation had a smell, violence had a taste, and lies left a bitter aftertaste that lingered like smoke. This man was telling the truth, but that only made his presence more mysterious, more threatening in its implications. "Then what have you come for?" she demanded, her voice carrying clearly across the superheated air that shimmered between them like water. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, heavy with portent and possibility. The 6 mounted warriors remained motionless as carved statues, their eyes fixed on the exchange with unnerving intensity that made her skin crawl. They were a wall of muscle and menace, she realized, a silent chorus backing their leader's solo performance in this deadly opera playing out in the desert heat. The leader, whose name was Gochiman, son of the legendary chief Cochise, though she didn't know that yet, took one slow, deliberate step forward, completely ignoring the weapon aimed at his heart. His movement was so fluid, so controlled, that it seemed almost inevitable, like water flowing downhill or the sun rising in the east. "My name is Gochiman," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air, each syllable pronounced with the careful precision of a man who understood the power of words. "I am the son of a great chief heir to warriors who have walked these mountains since the world was young. These," he gestured slightly toward his mounted companions, without taking his eyes off her, "are my brothers and my most trusted warriors, men who have ridden with me through fire and blood, who would die at my word and kill at my command." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her from the frayed hem of her denim trousers to the wild strands of sun-bleached hair that had escaped from the practical braid hanging down her back. She could feel him cataloging every detail, the calluses on her hands that spoke of hard labor, the rifle tan on her arms that marked her as a woman who worked outdoors, the lean muscle in her shoulders that came from chopping wood and hauling water, and doing a dozen other tasks that would have broken a softer woman. "We have journeyed for 3 days from the Sierra Madre." He continued, his voice taking on an almost ceremonial quality as if he were reciting words that had been rehearsed for this moment. We have ridden through heat that would kill lesser men, through country where water is more precious than blood, and every shadow might hide death. We have come to ask you to be my wife. The words struck Cora with the force of a physical blow, as if one of his warriors had put an arrow through her chest. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the relentless sun spinning overhead, while the silent mountains watched with ancient, knowing eyes. The familiar landmarks of her existence, the cabin where she'd been born, the spring where she'd played as a child, the garden where she'd buried her parents' few precious possessions, all blurred into an incomprehensible tableau that made no sense, held no meaning. Her finger tightened convulsively on the trigger. The cold steel of the pistol, the only real thing in a moment of utter, complete unreality. Marriage. The word was so foreign to her experience, so disconnected from the harsh reality of her solitary existence, that it might as well have been spoken in an alien tongue by creatures from another world. For a woman who had spoken to no one but herself for years, whose only conversations had been with mules and chickens and the desert wind. The proposal of marriage from a 7-foot Apache war chief she had never seen before wasn't just unthinkable. It was a form of madness so complete and absolute that it defied comprehension. You're insane. She finally breathed the words escaping her lips as a harsh whisper that barely carried across the space between them. Stark raving mad. Gatchaman didn't react to her insult with anger or wounded pride. His patience seemed as vast and deep as the desert sky above them, as enduring as the mountains that had watched over this land since time began. There was something almost supernatural about his composure, as if he had expected her reaction and prepared himself for it. It is not madness, he stated with simple, unshakable conviction that brooked no argument. It is our purpose. It is why we have come. Your purpose. Cora's voice rose, cracking slightly under the strain of emotions she had kept buried for 15 years. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to mock her with its own desperation. To ride onto a stranger's land and propose marriage to a woman you've never met, to terrorize someone who's done you no harm. She gestured wildly with the barrel of her pistol, the weapon wavering as her hand began to shake with the effort of holding it steady. Get off my property, all of you. Now. This instant. I don't care if you're the son of Cochise himself. You have no right to be here, no right to speak to me of marriage or anything else. The 6 mounted warriors shifted slightly in their saddles, a subtle ripple of movement that spoke of disciplined readiness, of men prepared for violence at a moment's notice. Their hands remained well away from their weapons, but she could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes constantly scanned for threats and opportunities. They were professionals, she realized with growing dread, men who had survived countless battles through skill, courage, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that turned warfare into an art form. They looked to their leader, awaiting his command, with the patient devotion of soldiers who trusted their chief's judgment absolutely. If Gatchaman gave the word, she knew they would charge her position without hesitation, accepting whatever casualties might result as the price of obedience and loyalty. Gatchaman himself remained perfectly still, a statue carved from living granite that seemed rooted to the desert floor, like one of the ancient saguaro cacti that dotted the landscape. His composure was more unnerving than any display of anger would have been, suggesting reserves of patience and determination that could outlast any opposition. "We will not leave," he said with calm finality that made her blood run cold. His tone wasn't threatening, there was no bluster or menace in it, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty, the voice of a man stating simple, incontrovertible fact. Not until you have heard our offer in full, understood the reasons that brought us here, and made your decision with complete knowledge of what we offer. "I've heard enough," Cora retorted. Though even as she spoke the words, she could hear the hollow ring of bravado in her own voice. "I don't know who you are or what kind of game you're playing, But I'm not interested in being anyone's squaw, anyone's property, anyone's prize to be won or bargained for. The answer is no today, tomorrow, and forever. Now leave, or I swear, by my father's grave, I'll start shooting, and I won't stop until every last one of you is dead or gone. To prove her point and demonstrate the seriousness of her threat, she shifted her aim slightly to the left and squeezed the trigger. The Colt Peacemaker roared like thunder, the .45 caliber round kicking up a fountain of red dust and pulverized rock exactly 6 inches from Gotchamin's left moccasin. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the valley, echoing off the canyon walls in a series of diminishing crashes that seemed to go on forever. It was a warning shot, clear and unambiguous, a demonstration of both her skill with the weapon and her willingness to use it. She had learned to shoot from her father, who had been a marksman of considerable reputation, before settling down to farm this harsh land, and 15 years of hunting for her survival had honed her natural ability to a razor's edge. The Apache leader didn't so much as flinch. His dark eyes remained locked on hers with unwavering intensity, his expression unchanged by the proximity of violent death. His men, too, remained stone-faced, their composure utterly unnerving in the face of lethal force. They were warriors who had faced rifle volleys and cavalry charges, men accustomed to the bark of guns and the whistle of bullets passing close enough to part their hair. "You are indeed a fine shot," Gotchamin acknowledged, with what might have been approval in his deep voice. "Your father taught you well before the fever took him. But you have only 5 more bullets in that weapon, and there are 7 of us. We are patient men, woman of the spring. We can wait longer than your ammunition will last." His casual reference to her father's death sent a chill down her spine. How could he possibly know about that? She had been 7 years old when the fever struck, too young to understand much beyond the fact that her parents had grown sick and died within days of each other, leaving her alone with a few fading memories and the desperate need to survive. "We do not wish you harm." Gotchamin continued his voice, taking on a gentler quality that was somehow more frightening than any threat would have been. "We wish to honor you, to offer you protection and companionship, to give you a place among our people, where you will never again know the crushing weight of solitude." He gestured around at her small, hardscrabble homestead with a sweeping motion that encompassed everything she had built and preserved through 15 years of backbreaking labor. "Look at your life, Cora Abernathy. You are alone, fighting for every scrap of survival in a land that shows no mercy to the weak or the isolated. Every day is a battle against sun and drought and predators both 4-legged and 2-legged. You work from dawn to dusk just to stay alive, with no one to share your burdens, no one to care if you live or die." His words struck her like physical blows, each observation a perfectly aimed arrow that found its mark in the most vulnerable parts of her psyche. He was describing her existence with surgical precision, laying bare the harsh truths she tried so hard not to think about during the long, empty nights when sleep wouldn't come, and the silence pressed against her eardrums like a weight. "With us," he continued relentlessly, "you would be part of something larger than yourself. The wife of a Chiricahua chief is not a slave or a servant. She is the heart of the lodge, the keeper of wisdom, the mother of warriors. She is respected by all, protected by many, and honored above all other women. You would want for nothing food, horses, blankets, jewelry, protection from all enemies. Your life of endless toil would be over, replaced by purpose and meaning, and the knowledge that you belong somewhere with people who value your strength and courage." His insight was devastating in its accuracy, cutting through her defenses like a blade through silk. He had, with a few simple sentences, perfectly summarized the brutal, exhausting truth of her existence, and offered her an alternative she had never dared to dream possible. The loneliness was indeed a constant ache, a phantom limb she had learned to live with, but never learned to ignore. Hearing it spoken aloud by this stranger felt like having her soul stripped naked and exposed to the merciless desert sun. "I like being alone. She lied through gritted teeth, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining her composure. I chose this life. I want nothing from you or anyone else. No one chooses to be the last one. Gotchaman replied with gentle, implacable certainty that made her want to scream with frustration. His dark eyes seemed to see straight through her pretense to the frightened, lonely woman beneath the hardened exterior. It is a fate that is thrust upon us by circumstance and tragedy. But it does not have to be the fate we keep. You have the power to choose differently, to step away from this prison of solitude you have built around yourself. The word prison hit her like a slap across the face. Is that what her life had become? She looked around at the cabin where she had been born, the garden she had planted with her own hands, the fence she had built to keep out predators, the spring that had sustained her through drought and plenty. Was this home? Or was it a cage she had locked herself into out of fear and grief and the inability to imagine any other way of living? Frustration and a growing sense of helplessness washed over her in waves, threatening to drown her in emotions she had spent 15 years learning to suppress. This was a situation her father had never prepared her for, a challenge that couldn't be met with rifle fire or stubborn determination. She knew how to handle rattlesnakes and mountain lions, desperate prospectors, and Mexican bandits. She had no idea how to handle this calculated patience, this siege of courtesy that was slowly but surely undermining every defense she had built. "I have nothing more to say to you," she said finally, lowering her pistol, though keeping it firmly gripped in her hand. The weight of the weapon was reassuring, a tangible reminder that she still had some power in this situation, some ability to defend herself if words gave way to violence. "The answer is no today, tomorrow, and forever. Stay or go, it makes no difference to me. But cross this line." She drew an imaginary boundary in the dirt, with the toe of her worn boot scoring a clear mark in the red earth about 10 feet in front of her. "And you'll be digging bullets out of your hide." Without waiting for a reply, she turned her back on them, a calculated risk, a show of defiance she didn't truly feel, and walked toward her cabin with measured steps that betrayed none of the fear churning in her gut. It was a dangerous gamble, presenting her unprotected back to 7 armed warriors, but she needed to demonstrate that she wasn't cowed by their presence, that she remained in control of her own domain. The heavy wooden door groaned on its leather hinges as she pushed it open, and she immediately stepped inside and dropped the thick iron bar into place with a solid thunk that seemed to echo through the small space. Her hands were shaking with delayed reaction, and she leaned against the door with her eyes closed, listening for sounds that would tell her what came next. She expected to hear the sound of hoofbeats, the sounds of their departure, as they gave up this inexplicable quest and returned to whatever stronghold had spawned them. Instead, there was nothing but the gradual return of normal desert sounds, the chatter of birds cautiously resuming their daily activities, the hum of insects in the heat, the whisper of wind through the mesquite and palo verde. Curiosity finally overcame caution, and she moved to the single window that faced east toward the spring, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter her father had built to keep out both weather and bullets. What she saw made her heart sink, like a stone dropped into deep water. They hadn't left. Instead, they had dismounted and were in the process of setting up what looked like a permanent camp near the base of the western ridge, well outside the line she had drawn, but squarely, undeniably, on her land. They moved with quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice tending to their horses, with the careful attention of men who understood that their lives might depend on their mount's condition. Building a small, smokeless fire, using techniques that left no trace visible from more than a few yards away, and settling in with the patient determination of men prepared to wait as long as necessary. Cold dread washed over Cora like water from a mountain stream. They weren't leaving. They weren't giving up. They were laying siege to her solitude with the most devastating weapon imaginable, time itself. This wasn't a raid or an attack she could fight with bullets and barricades. It wasn't a threat she could drive off with harsh words and displays of force. It was a test of wills, a silent war of attrition in which her enemies held every advantage. They had numbers supplies, and most importantly, they had each other for company and support. All she had was 100 acres of hardscrabble land, a dwindling supply of ammunition, and a loneliness that was suddenly more terrifying than any external threat. As dusk began to bleed across the sky in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows from the 7 silent warriors camped on her land, Cora Abernathy felt the first crack appear in the fortress of her isolation, and she feared with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that what came flooding through that crack might be enough to drown her completely. The first night was the longest of Cora's life, and that was saying something for a woman who had endured 15 years of solitary darkness. She sat in her cabin with her back against the barred door and her rifle across her knees, listening to every sound that drifted across the desert air. The Apache camp was utterly silent. No conversation, no movement, no indication that 7 armed warriors were settled less than 100 yards from her front door. That silence was more unnerving than war cries would have been. It spoke of discipline, so complete, patience, so absolute, that it seemed inhuman. She found herself straining to hear something, anything that would prove they were still there, and not figments of her heat-addled imagination. Dawn came with its usual brutal efficiency, the sun climbing over the eastern mountains like a ball of white-hot metal fresh from a forge. Cora had managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep, her dreams filled with dark eyes and patient voices speaking of marriage and destiny. She rose stiff and unrested her body, protesting the night spent on the hard floor in an impossible position. Peering through her window crack, she saw that the Apache camp was already awake and active. Gotchiman stood by a small fire cup in hand, his massive frame silhouetted against the brightening sky. 2 of his warriors were tending to the horses, checking hooves and examining gear with the thoroughness of men whose lives depended on such details. The others were engaged in quiet conversation, their voices so low she couldn't make out words, even in the still morning air. They looked, she realized, with growing unease, as if they had settled in for a very long stay. The second day passed in a strange, tense rhythm that felt like a dance performed by opponents who knew all the steps. Cora went about her normal morning chores, feeding her chickens, collecting eggs, checking the fence line for damage with elaborate, deliberate normalcy. She was making a statement, she told herself, that their presence didn't intimidate her, that she remained in complete control of her own domain. But she was acutely, painfully aware of being watched every moment. She could feel 7 pairs of eyes tracking her movements as she worked, cataloging her habits and routines, studying her with the patient intensity of hunters observing their prey. The sensation made her skin crawl and her shoulders itch, as if she were perpetually on the verge of having arrows sprout from her back. The Apache, for their part, made no attempt to approach her or cross the line she had drawn in the dirt. They seemed content to observe from a distance, maintaining their respectful boundary, while making their permanent presence absolutely clear. They hunted in the hills beyond her valley, disappearing before dawn, and returning at midday with deer or javelina, the quiet work of skinning and butchering carried out with ritualistic precision that spoke of deep cultural traditions. On the morning of the 3rd day, Cora made an unsettling discovery. Her supplies, flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, were running dangerously low. It was a trip to Redemption Gulch she had been postponing for weeks, partly due to her natural reluctance to leave her sanctuary, and partly because she dreaded the journey through increasingly hostile territory, where Apache raids were becoming more common. Now, with 7 warriors camped on her land, and the idea of leaving her homestead unguarded sent waves of panic through her chest. What would she find when she returned? Would her cabin be burned? Her few possessions scattered to the desert wind? Would they simply be gone? Vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared, leaving her to wonder if the entire encounter had been some sort of heat-induced hallucination. But staying wasn't an option either. Without supplies, she would slowly starve, and her ammunition situation was becoming critical. If trouble came, and in this land, trouble always came. Eventually, she needed to be prepared. She rose before dawn on the fourth day, moving through her pre-departure routine with mechanical precision born of long practice. She saddled Jezebel, her sturdiest mule, checking and double-checking every strap and buckle, with the obsessive care of someone whose life might depend on such details. She packed 2 empty flour sacks and made a mental list of essential supplies, calculating in her head how much money she had saved and what purchases were absolutely necessary versus merely desirable. As the first pale light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, painting them in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful, under other circumstances, she unbarred her door and stepped outside. Her rifle was in her hands, loaded and ready, though she wasn't sure what she intended to do with it, beyond making a statement about her continued defiance. The Apache camp was already awake. She was beginning to suspect they never truly slept, maintaining some sort of rotating watch that kept at least one set of eyes alert at all times. Gotchiman stood by their small fire, with something steaming in his hands, probably some sort of herbal tea that would help them endure the day's heat. He watched her lead Jezebel toward the trail that wound out of the valley, his dark eyes following her every movement with unwavering attention. He made no move to stop her, offered no parting words or threats. He simply observed, as patient and immovable as the mountains themselves. As she passed their camp at the widest possible berth, keeping the maximum distance while still following the established trail, she felt the weight of 7 pairs of eyes tracking her progress like the crosshairs of invisible rifles. The sensation was like walking through a gauntlet of silent judgment, each step taking her further from the relative safety of her cabin and deeper into uncertainty. Part of her expected to hear the thunder of hoofbeats behind her, to feel the impact of an arrow between her shoulder blades, or the crack of a rifle shot echoing off the canyon walls. But the Apache let her go without interference, maintaining their vigil of patience and discipline. The ride to Redemption Gulch took most of the morning, the trail winding through increasingly desolate country, where the heat was already becoming oppressive despite the early hour. The landscape was painted in shades of red and brown, and gold broken by the occasional splash of green where underground water fed hardy desert plants. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, but it was also utterly unforgiving to anyone who didn't understand its rules and respect its power. Redemption Gulch wasn't much to look at: a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings that seemed to huddle together for mutual protection against the vast emptiness surrounding them. There was Henderson's Mercantile, where she could get supplies; Murphy's Saloon, where she never set foot; Jameson's blacksmith shop, where she occasionally had work done on tools or her mule's shoes; the assayer's office, where prospectors brought their hopeful samples; and the sheriff's office with its attached jail, a small stone building that represented the thin veneer of law and order in this wild territory. The town was populated by the usual mixture of hard-bitten prospectors chasing dreams of gold and silver, weary ranchers trying to scratch a living from uncooperative land, and women whose eyes held the same steel resilience that Cora saw in her own reflection. There were also gamblers, drifters, petty criminals, and various other human flotsam that washed up in frontier settlements where questions about the past were considered impolite. She was a known figure here, though not well understood, the Abernathy girl, the hermit who lived out by the old Dragoon Pass. People nodded to her politely, but maintained their distance, recognizing something in her manner that suggested she wasn't interested in casual conversation or social interaction. She tied Jezebel to the hitching post outside Henderson's Mercantile. The familiar creak of old leather and jingle of metal hardware, somehow comforting in its normalcy. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful ding that seemed jarringly optimistic given her current state of mind. The store was blissfully cool and dark after the blazing heat outside, filled with the mingled aromas of coffee beans, leather goods, dried apples, and the dozen other scents that marked a well-stocked frontier trading post. Florence Henderson, a portly woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an unfortunate tendency toward gossip, looked up from behind the counter, where she had been arranging bolts of cloth. "Our Cora child," Florence exclaimed with genuine warmth, her round face creasing into a welcoming smile. "Lord have mercy, it's been months since we've seen you in town. You look peaked, honey. Everything all right out your way?" The question was innocent enough, but it opened a floodgate of emotions Cora had been struggling to contain. For a moment, she was tempted to pour out the entire impossible story. 7 Apache warriors, a marriage proposal, the siege of patience that was slowly driving her towards some sort of breakdown. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by 15 years of habitual self-reliance, and the certain knowledge that no one would believe her anyway. "Just need some supplies," she said curtly, pulling out her mental list. "Flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges for the rifle. 45 to 70 if you have them." As Florence bustled around, gathering the requested items, humming tunelessly under her breath, a man who had been lingering by the barrels of pickles and crackers turned toward Cora with predatory interest. Sterling Croft was handsome, in a slick, calculated way that immediately put her on guard, too clean, too well-dressed, too smooth for a town like Redemption Gulch. His mustache was precisely trimmed, his clothes were made of fine cloth that hadn't seen much honest work, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who viewed everything and everyone in terms of potential profit. Croft owned the large ranch that bordered her property to the north, a sprawling operation that seemed to expand every year through a combination of legitimate purchases and more questionable methods. He had made several offers to buy her land, over the years offers that grew increasingly aggressive and less polite with each refusal. "Miss Abernathy," Croft said smoothly, tipping his hat with mock courtesy that didn't reach his calculating eyes. "What a pleasure to see you in town. I trust your spring is still running clear, such a valuable resource in times like these." There was something in his tone, some hint of hidden knowledge that made her instantly wary. "It is," she replied tersely, not trusting herself to say more. "Good, good." He continued stroking his mustache with one manicured finger. "A resource like that, while a young woman all alone needs to be careful. These are dangerous times, I hear. The Apache are restless raiding parties crossing up from Mexico. A woman in your position might want to consider alternative arrangements." The opening was there, and despite every instinct screaming at her to remain silent, the pressure that had been building for days suddenly burst out in a desperate rush of words. "I have a problem, Mr. Croft." She heard herself saying the admission torn from her throat against her better judgment. "There are 7 of them, Apache warriors camped on my land." Florence Henderson gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Several other customers turned to stare, and Cora suddenly found herself the center of unwanted attention. Croft's eyes narrowed with what looked like genuine interest, though she caught a flicker of something else in his expression, satisfaction perhaps, or anticipation. "On your land?" he asked with apparent concern that didn't quite ring true. "My God, woman, are they threatening you, raiding your stock?" "No," Cora admitted, feeling increasingly foolish with each word. "They're just there. Their leader, he asked me to marry him." The statement fell into the store's sudden silence, like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the assembled customers. Florence stared at her as if she had grown a second head, while several of the men began to chuckle and shake their heads in obvious disbelief. Croft, after a moment of what appeared to be stunned silence, let out a short, sharp laugh that held no real humor. "Marry him," he repeated, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Well, I'll be damned. The desert heat must be getting to them. Or perhaps to you, Miss Abernathy." The implication stung like a slap across the face. "It's the truth," Cora insisted, her cheeks flushing with anger and embarrassment. They've been there for 4 days now. They won't leave, won't explain themselves properly, won't take no for an answer. Then you need the law." Florence whispered, her voice tight with nervous energy. "Sheriff Kane will know what to do. He'll run them off, send them back where they came from." The suggestion offered a fragile thread of hope, something Cora could grasp in her growing desperation. She paid for her supplies with shaking hands, loaded them onto Jezebel with mechanical precision, and walked across the dusty street to the sheriff's office, with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in days. Sheriff Bartholomew Kane was a man well past his prime, with a drooping mustache stained yellow from tobacco juice, and a belly that strained the buttons of his shirt to their breaking point. He had been a competent lawman once, according to local stories, but years of dealing with petty crimes and drunken minors had worn him down to a shadow of his former self. He looked up from the tedious task of cleaning a double-barreled shotgun with the weary disinterest of a man who had heard every sob story and tall tale the frontier had to offer. Cora told her story again, forcing herself to keep her voice flat and factual, leaving out none of the bizarre details that made it sound like the ravings of a woman driven mad by isolation and heat. She described Gotchamin's appearance, his strange proposal, the patient siege that was slowly driving her toward some sort of breakdown. She tried to convey the reality of 7 armed warriors camped on her land without sounding like she was making excuses or seeking attention. Kane listened with the same bored expression he probably wore, while processing reports of stolen chickens and boundary disputes, leaning back in his creaking chair, and occasionally spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon with practiced accuracy. When she finished her account, he set the shotgun aside and sighed heavily, the sound of a man confronted with problems he didn't want to deal with. "Miss Abernathy." He began with the condescending patience of an adult addressing a particularly slow child. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. 7 Chiricahua warriors, who by all accounts should be down in Mexico with Geronimo's band, fighting the army, are camped on your property. They haven't stolen anything, haven't harmed you, or your animals haven't fired so much as a single shot in anger. They're just sitting there quiet as church mice. And their chief, who speaks perfect English, like he was educated back east, has politely proposed marriage. Is that about the size of it?" The way he summarized it made her story sound ridiculous, even to her own ears. "Yes," she said through gritted teeth, hating how weak and desperate she sounded. Kane picked up a piece of paper from his cluttered desk and studied it with exaggerated interest. "Says here that Sterling Croft filed a complaint last week. Claims you've been damming up the creek that feeds from your spring, cutting off the water flow to his cattle. Says his stock are starting to suffer and he's losing money. That's a lie." Cora shot back anger flaring in her chest like struck tinder. "My spring doesn't feed any creek on his property. The water soaks into the ground before it gets anywhere near his land. He just wants my water rights, wants to force me out so he can expand his holdings." "Maybe so," Kane said with elaborate unconcern, tossing the paper aside like it was of no importance. "But here's my point, Miss Abernathy. I have actual problems to deal with: drunks fighting in Murphy's saloon every Saturday night, prospectors jumping each other's claims out in the hills, cattlemen feuding over grazing rights, folks like Mr. Croft filing official complaints that have to be investigated. What you've got is a story, and a pretty fantastical one at that." He leaned forward slightly, his small eyes boring into hers with bureaucratic certainty. "There's no crime here, Miss Abernathy. No law against a man asking a woman to marry him, no matter who he is or where he comes from. And there's sure as hell no law that says I have to ride out into the Dragoon Mountains and pick a fight with 7 Apache warriors because you don't like them camping on your property. So you're not going to do anything?" Cora asked, feeling her last hope crumble like adobe brick in the rain. "Nothing to be done," the sheriff said dismissively, already reaching for his shotgun again. "My advice to you is simple. Either sell your land to Mr. Croft and move somewhere safer, or learn to get along with your new neighbors. Maybe take up that marriage proposal if it's legitimate. Apache women seem to do well enough. The casual cruelty of his suggestion hit her like a physical blow. Without another word, she turned and strode out of the office, her back ramrod straight, despite the humiliation burning in her chest. She had come to civilization seeking help, and had found only ridicule, bureaucratic indifference, and barely concealed corruption. As she mounted Jezebel for the long ride home, she saw Sterling Croft watching her from the shaded porch of Murphy's saloon, a satisfied smile playing around his lips as he sipped whiskey from a cut glass tumbler. He raised the glass in a mocking toast, his meaning crystal clear. He had been in the sheriff's office before her poisoning the well with complaints and insinuations, painting her as a hysterical woman whose word couldn't be trusted. In that moment of bitter clarity, Cora understood the true scope of her isolation. The threat wasn't just the 7 silent warriors on her land, but the smiling, civilized predator who wanted what she had and a system of law that would do nothing to protect her from either enemy. The ride back to her valley was filled with cold, hard resolve that settled in her chest like ice water. If she was going to survive this, whatever this ultimately turned out to be, she would have to do it herself with her own resources and on her own terms. The world had drawn its battle lines, and she found herself standing alone on one side with everyone else arrayed against her. The return to her homestead brought no relief, only the weary resignation of a woman who had run out of options and allies. The sight of the Apache camp, a thin plume of smoke rising in the late afternoon air, no longer sparked immediate panic, but rather a bone-deep weariness that seemed to settle into her very soul. They were part of her landscape now, as fixed and immovable as the mountains behind them, and Sheriff Kane's dismissal had extinguished her last hope of outside intervention. This was her battle to be fought on her terms, with whatever weapons she could muster. The next few days established a routine that was both surreal and oddly comforting in its predictability. Cora went about her daily chores with deliberate, almost defiant normalcy, feeding her chickens, tending her vegetable garden, mending fences, hauling water from the spring. She was acutely aware of being watched every moment, studied with the patient intensity of naturalists, observing a rare and interesting specimen. But gradually, imperceptibly, her fear began to give way to a grudging curiosity. The Apache warriors weren't the savage monsters of newspaper stories and barroom tales. They were disciplined, organized, respectful of boundaries she had established. More importantly, they began to reveal themselves as individuals rather than a monolithic threat. One of the younger warriors, she noticed, was extraordinarily gifted with a bow. He spent hours each day practicing with a short, powerful weapon that seemed to be an extension of his own body, sending arrow after arrow into targets improvised from bundles of dried grass. His accuracy was supernatural. She watched him split his own arrows at 50 yards, place shots within a hand's span at distances that would have challenged her rifle. Another warrior, older with distinctive streaks of gray in his long hair, spent much of his time carving intricate figures from pieces of desert ironwood. His hands, scarred from countless battles, moved with surprising delicacy as he coaxed birds and animals and human forms from the hardwood. The finished pieces were works of art that would have commanded high prices in eastern cities. She heard them laugh quietly among themselves during their evening meals, a sound so unexpected and human that it initially startled her. They told stories in their own language, the musical rise and fall of Apache words carrying clearly across the desert air. They cared for their horses with the meticulous attention of men whose lives might depend on their mount's condition, grooming them daily, checking hooves and legs for problems, ensuring they had adequate water and the best available forage. Most surprisingly, she began to see their reverence for the land itself. They moved through her valley, like men walking in a sacred place, careful not to damage plants, unnecessarily scattering the ashes from their fires, cleaning up after themselves with obsessive thoroughness. They took only what they needed from the environment and gave back more than they took. Gotchaman himself remained an enigma, a figure of massive presence. who seemed to command the absolute respect and loyalty of his men through some combination of wisdom, courage, and natural authority. She often saw him standing alone at the edge of their camp, gazing toward her cabin with patient, unwavering attention that made her skin crawl with its intensity. It was becoming clear that his initial words had failed to achieve their purpose, that his formal proposal had been too alien and unexpected for her to process properly. So he began to speak in a different language, entirely the language of the land itself. The only tongue she truly understood. The first gift appeared on a Tuesday morning, lying on the flat stone that served as her doorstep, like an offering left for some vengeful god. It was a freshly killed rabbit, cleaned and dressed with surgical precision, ready for the cooking pot. Her initial reaction was suspicion so intense it made her hands shake. Was it poisoned? Was this some sort of trap designed to make her sick or dependent? But careful examination revealed nothing sinister. It was simply a fine, healthy animal that had been killed quickly and humanely prepared with obvious skill and care. It was a gift, a peace offering, an attempt at communication that transcended the barriers of language and cultural difference. Pride warred briefly with pragmatism in her chest, but pragmatism won the day. Wasting good meat was not just foolish, but sinful in this harsh land where every calorie might mean the difference between life and death. With a sense of begrudging concession that felt like crossing some invisible line, she cooked the rabbit for her supper. It was, she had to admit, one of the best meals she'd eaten in months. The gifts continued over the following days, always game, always perfectly prepared, always left in the same place where she couldn't miss them but couldn't see who had made the delivery. A brace of quail one morning, their small bodies still warm from the kill. A young deer haunch that would provide meat for a week. Fish from streams she didn't even know existed in this seemingly barren landscape. She found herself reciprocating almost without conscious thought, leaving portions of her garden's harvest squash and beans and corn on the same stone where the meat appeared. It wasn't payment exactly, and it wasn't surrender. It was something else entirely, some form of primitive communication that bypassed the civilized mind and spoke directly to older, deeper instincts. The most significant breakthrough came during the second week of their strange coexistence. A violent summer storm had rolled in from the east during the night, one of those spectacular desert tempests that turned the sky black and unleashed torrents of rain, accompanied by winds strong enough to uproot trees. Cora had huddled in her cabin, listening to the fury outside, grateful for her father's solid construction, but worried about her animals and the various small structures that kept her homestead functional. Dawn revealed the expected damage. A section of fence protecting her chicken coop had been knocked down by a falling cottonwood branch, leaving her birds vulnerable to coyotes, foxes, and the dozen other predators that viewed chickens as convenient meals. The branch itself was easily 6 inches in diameter and 15 feet long, far too heavy for her to move alone, even if she'd had the tools and leverage to manage such a task. She stood staring at the destruction, calculating in her head how long it would take to clear the debris and repair the fence, working by herself, when she became aware of movement in her peripheral vision. 2 of Gotchiman's warriors were approaching at a respectful distance, their hands empty of weapons and their posture suggesting they had come to help rather than threaten. They didn't speak to her, didn't even look directly at her, but simply began to work. With shared unspoken understanding that spoke of years of cooperation, they used their powerful shoulders and a leverage technique she didn't recognize to heave the heavy branch aside as if it weighed no more than a child's toy. One of them, the older warrior with gray-streaked hair, produced a coil of sinew from a leather pouch and set about repairing the broken wire with nimble fingers that moved with surprising delicacy. When they were finished, the fence was actually stronger than it had been before the storm, and the wire stretched taut and secured with knots that would have challenged a sailor. They gave her a slight respectful nod, the first direct acknowledgement she had received from any of them except Gotchiman, and walked back to their camp without a word. Cora stood in the aftermath of their kindness, stunned by what had just occurred. It was an act of simple, unasked-for help and the kind of neighborly assistance she hadn't received from another human being in 15 years. There had been no expectation of reward or reciprocation. No attempt to use the gesture as leverage for some larger agenda. They had seen a problem possessed the ability to solve it and acted accordingly. The gesture chipped away another piece of her carefully constructed defenses, revealing beneath the hardened exterior a confusion of gratitude, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. But it was the incident with Bartholomew that truly changed everything. One of her mules, the older one, named after the biblical patriarch, had gotten himself thoroughly tangled in a thicket of mesquite bushes while grazing in the far pasture. Bartholomew was not the brightest animal she'd ever owned, but he was steady and reliable, capable of carrying heavy loads over rough terrain without complaint. Now he was panicking, pulling against the thorny branches that had snared his halter, tearing his own hide with his struggles, making the situation progressively worse with each desperate attempt to free himself. Cora's efforts to calm him were failing completely. The mule was too frightened to respond to her voice, too panicked to follow her attempts to lead him backward out of the tangle. She was beginning to consider the grim possibility that she might have to put him down, rather than watch him slowly tear himself apart when she became aware of another presence. Gatchaman was there, moving with the silent, fluid grace that seemed to be his natural mode of locomotion. He didn't approach the panicked animal directly, a mistake that would have triggered even more violent struggling, but instead began to circle around the thicket at a respectful distance, speaking in a low, crooning voice that she had never heard before. The language was Apache, but the tone was universal, soft, rhythmic, infinitely patient. It was the voice a mother might use to calm a frightened child, the voice of wind through pine trees, or water flowing over smooth stones. Bartholomew's ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull in terror, began to twitch and swivel toward the sound. His frantic struggling gradually lessened as some primitive part of his brain recognized the voice of a natural horseman, a man who understood the language of prey, animals and predators. Gatchaman continued his low musical monologue as he approached the trapped mule, moving without fear or haste, his large hands gentle and sure as he took hold of the halter. He didn't pull or force, just stood there like a mountain, his voice a constant, soothing presence, one hand stroking the animal's sweat-soaked neck, while the other began the delicate work of untangling the restraining branches. Cora watched in fascination, seeing something she had never experienced in 15 years of managing livestock. She had always dealt with her animals through a combination of stubbornness, physical strength, and the kind of brute force pragmatism that got the job done, but left everyone involved exhausted and resentful. This was something entirely different, a form of communication that transcended species, a communion between minds that spoke to instincts older than civilization. Slowly, painstakingly, Gatchaman worked to free the trapped animal. He broke away thorny branches one by one, never ceasing his calming monologue, never showing impatience or frustration when progress seemed impossibly slow. His movements were economical and precise, wasting no energy on unnecessary gestures, every action calculated to minimize stress and maximize effectiveness. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, Bartholomew was free. Gatchaman led him carefully out of the thicket, checking the scratches on his hide with professional thoroughness, running experienced hands down the mule's legs to ensure no serious damage had been done. Only when he was satisfied that the animal was essentially unhurt did he look at Cora directly. For the first time since his arrival, his stoic mask slipped completely. He offered her a small smile that transformed his granite features into something unexpectedly warm and human. "He has a strong spirit," Gatchaman said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. "Like you." Cora didn't know how to respond to the compliment, if that's what it had been. The defenses she had so carefully constructed over 15 years of solitude were beginning to feel less like protection and more like prison walls barriers that kept out not just danger, but also the possibility of connection, understanding, even friendship. These men, these Apache warriors who had ridden out of legend to camp on her land, were not the savage monsters of newspaper accounts and frontier mythology. They were disciplined professionals, yes, and undoubtedly dangerous in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. But they were also providers and protectors, men who possessed skills and knowledge that could make her harsh existence significantly easier. More importantly, Gotchiman had just demonstrated something that challenged every assumption she had made about his motives and character. He hadn't freed her mule to impress her or curry favor or demonstrate his superiority. He had seen a problem within his ability to solve, and had acted accordingly, expecting nothing in return beyond the satisfaction of preventing unnecessary suffering. That evening, as she treated Bartholomew's minor cuts with healing salve her father had taught her to make from desert plants, she found herself humming a tune her mother used to sing a melody she hadn't recalled in years. Notes that seemed to drift from some buried part of her memory like water rising from a hidden spring. The silence of her valley was no longer empty or oppressive. It was filled with watchful presence, and for the first time in a very long while, it felt less like loneliness and more like anticipation of something she couldn't yet name, but was beginning very tentatively to hope for. By the end of the second week, a strange equilibrium had been established that felt both fragile and oddly permanent. Cora no longer automatically reached for her pistol when she stepped outside her cabin, though the weapon remained within easy reach as a matter of practical caution. The Apache warriors had become part of her daily landscape, as predictable as sunrise and sunset, as constant as the mountains that ringed her small valley. Their gifts of game continued with clockwork regularity, and she had fallen into the habit of reciprocating with portions of her garden's harvest fresh vegetables that must have been a welcome change from their diet of meat and whatever wild plants they could forage from the harsh desert. It was a trade arrangement of sorts, she told herself, a practical exchange that benefited both parties without implying any deeper significance. But she knew in the part of her mind that remained brutally honest despite all her rationalizations that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of her world. The siege of patience was working exactly as Gotchiman had intended, wearing down her resistance not through force or threat, but through the simple, relentless demonstration that alternatives to her solitary existence were possible. Yet the central mystery remained unsolved, gnawing at her consciousness like a persistent ache. Why her? The question haunted her sleeping and waking hours, a puzzle with missing pieces that she couldn't solve, no matter how many different approaches she tried. It couldn't be her beauty. 15 years of desert sun and wind had weathered her face. To leather roughened her hands until they resembled tree bark, turned her hair from golden silk to sun-bleached straw. She had seen her reflection in still water often enough to know that whatever prettiness she might have possessed as a child had been burned away by the harsh realities of frontier survival. It couldn't be her land, valuable though it was. The Apache were mountain people nomads, who followed the seasons, and the game, not farmers who valued permanent settlements and agricultural potential. Her 100 acres of hard-scrabbled desert would mean nothing to men who claimed entire mountain ranges as their ancestral territory. It couldn't be her wealth. She had none beyond the basic necessities of survival. Her cabin was solid but plain, her few possessions chosen for utility rather than value. She owned 2 mules, a handful of chickens, and enough tools to maintain her meager existence. Any Apache raiding party could acquire more valuable plunder from a single successful attack on a cavalry patrol or merchant wagon. The mystery consumed her thoughts, becoming an obsession that overshadowed even her concerns about immediate survival. She found herself studying Gotchiman whenever he was visible, trying to read some clue in his granite features or patient demeanor that would explain his inexplicable presence in her life. One evening, as sunset painted the western sky in shades of fire and gold, Gotchiman approached her cabin alone for the first time since that initial confrontation. He stopped at the line she had drawn in the dirt weeks ago, a boundary that had taken on symbolic significance far beyond its practical purpose, representing the fragile barrier between her old life and whatever unknown future he represented. "Och Cora Abernathy." He called out his voice, carrying clearly in the still air, with the formal courtesy of a man requesting an audience with royalty. "May I speak with you? The time has come for you to know the truth, to understand the reasons that brought us across the desert to your door." Cora had been cleaning her rifle on the porch, the familiar ritual of maintenance, serving as both practical necessity and nervous activity to occupy her restless hands. The weapon was loaded and ready. It was always loaded and ready these days. But she had stopped thinking of it as protection against Gotchiman personally. Whatever his ultimate intentions, she had become convinced that he posed no immediate physical threat to her safety. She set the rifle aside, though she kept it within easy reach, and nodded her permission for him to speak. Curiosity had long since replaced fear as her dominant emotion, and she found herself genuinely eager to hear whatever explanation he was prepared to offer. "Speak," she said simply. Gotchiman did not cross the invisible line that separated them, maintaining the respectful distance that had characterized all their interactions. He stood there in the gathering darkness, a tall silhouette against the dying light, and began to tell a story that would change everything she thought she knew about her own life and legacy. 16 years ago. He began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of an oral tradition that stretched back through countless generations. "My father, the great Chief Cochise, led a small war party through these mountains. They were not raiding. Cochise was a man of peace in those days, before the white man's treachery turned him to war. They were returning to our stronghold in the Sierra Madre after council with the Navajo, carrying messages and gifts between allied tribes." Cora listened with growing fascination as pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed began to stir in the depths of her memory, like sediment disturbed by moving water. They were ambushed in the high passes. Gotchiman continued, his voice taking on a harder edge that spoke of old anger and fresh grief. "Not by soldiers Cochise could have handled soldiers. They were attacked by Mexican bounty hunters, animals in human form, who hunted our people for the gold that scalps would bring in the markets of Sonora and Chihuahua. The bounty system was infamous throughout the Southwest, a policy that paid cash rewards for Apache scalps without bothering to distinguish between warriors and women, adults, and children. It had turned the borderlands into a charnel house, where murder was not just legal, but profitable, where the worst elements of both cultures could pursue their bloodlust under the sanction of official policy. The fight was fierce, but brief. Gotchiman said, his dark eyes fixed on hers with burning intensity. "My father was gravely wounded. A bullet had shattered the bone in his leg, leaving him unable to ride or even walk. He commanded his warriors to leave him to save themselves and carry word back to our people. They refused, but the bounty hunters were closing in with dogs and fresh horses, and my father knew that staying meant death for everyone." Cora found herself leaning forward, slightly caught up in the story despite herself. Flickering images were beginning to surface in her mind, hazy, half-forgotten memories from when she was perhaps 6 or 7 years old. Fragments of scenes that had made no sense to a child, but were now clicking into place with devastating clarity. Cochise hid himself in a small cave. Gotchiman continued, preparing to make his final stand, to die fighting, so that his men could escape with their lives and their honor intact. He was alone, bleeding his life away into the desert soil, his strength fading with the setting sun. He had made his peace with death, composed his spirit for the journey to the land beyond the stars. The Apache leader paused, his gaze meeting hers across the twilight, with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "But he was not alone," Gotchiman said quietly. "A white man found him there, a man with hair the color of ripe corn and eyes like the summer sky. A man who lived in this very valley, who called this spring his home." Cora's breath caught sharply. My father, she whispered the words barely audible. Yes, Gotchaman confirmed with solemn reverence. Orin Abernathy. He was hunting in the high country and heard the sounds of battle echoing among the peaks. He found my father near death, hidden in that cave like a wounded animal waiting to die. He could have left him there. It would have been the safe thing, the prudent thing. He could have killed him with his own hands and claimed the bounty that would have made him rich by frontier standards. The Apache chief's voice took on a quality of profound respect that made each word ring like struck bronze. He did neither. He saw not an Apache warrior, not an enemy of his people, but simply a man in desperate need of help. He threw away his own safety, risked his own life and the lives of his family to do what he believed was right. More memories were surfacing now, clearer and more detailed, like a fog lifting from a familiar landscape. Cora could see her father's face younger then, but already marked by the lines that came from squinting into desert distances. She could remember the worry in her mother's eyes, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the sense that something momentous and dangerous was happening just beyond her childish understanding. He carried my father back to this cabin. Gotchaman continued, his voice filled with wonder at the magnitude of her father's courage. Orin Abernathy, who weighed perhaps 160 pounds, somehow managed to transport a man nearly twice his size across miles of rough country through terrain that would challenge a healthy man on foot. He and your mother Margaret cleaned my father's wounds, set the shattered bone, and hid him from the bounty hunters who scoured these mountains for days, following blood trails and dog scent like the human vultures they were. Now she could remember clearly the strange, dark-skinned man who had occupied her parents' bed for what seemed like weeks, speaking in guttural sounds that bore no resemblance to any language she knew. Her mother's constant worry, the way she would jump at unexpected sounds, and the unusual caution with which her father approached his daily chores. The smell of unfamiliar herbs, the low moaning sounds that came from the bedroom during the worst nights, the sense that death itself was hovering just outside their door. For 2 weeks, Gotchaman said, his voice filled with profound gratitude that seemed to encompass not just his own feelings, but those of his entire people. Your parents nursed my father back to health. They shared their food, though they had little to spare, gave him their own bed, though it meant sleeping on the hard floor protected him, though discovery would have meant death for all of them. When he was finally strong enough to travel, your father gave him one of his own mules, provided food for the journey, and showed him a secret trail through the mountains that would take him safely home. Gotchaman took a step forward, his feet finally crossing the invisible line that had separated them for so long. But he was no longer a threat or an invader. He was an emissary of the past, a living bridge between her present and a history she had never fully understood. Before my father left this place, Gotchaman said solemnly, he made a vow that has shaped the course of my entire life. He swore an oath of blood and honor, the most sacred promise that exists between Apache people. He declared that the debt between the House of Cochise and the House of Abernathy would never be forgotten, never be considered paid, never be allowed to fade from tribal memory. The Apache chief paused, his dark eyes boring into hers with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense and see straight through to her soul. He swore that our people would forever see this land this spring, not as territory to be conquered or claimed, but as sacred ground under our eternal protection. Any man who raised his hand against the Abernathy family would be considered an enemy of the Chiricahua people, to be hunted down and destroyed without mercy or hesitation. Cora felt the world shifting around her like sand in an earthquake, old certainties crumbling while new realities took their place. Her father's death, her years of isolation, her ability to survive alone in hostile territory. Suddenly everything took on new significance, new meaning that she was only beginning to comprehend. And he made one final promise. Gotchaman said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the still desert air. He saw you, Cora Abernathy, a small girl with your mother's blue eyes, and your father's stubborn courage playing by the cabin door while your parents tended to his wounds. He told your father, "One day when she is a woman, grown, my son will come to this place. He will come not as a conqueror, but as a suitor to join our bloodlines and unite our families forever. The daughter of the man who saved my life will be honored as the wife of the man who will lead my people. The debt of blood will be repaid in the union of our children, and the circle will be complete." The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with stunning, earth-shattering clarity that left her reeling. This wasn't a whim or a conquest, wasn't the random act of a warrior drunk on his own power. It was a sacred promise, a 16-year-old oath made between a dying chief and a frontier farmer, sealed in blood and honor, and the most powerful forces that governed Apache society. "My father died 2 winters ago." Gotchiman concluded, his voice soft with grief that was still fresh, despite the passage of time. Cochise, the great chief, who fought the cavalry to a standstill, who made the white man's army tremble at the mention of his name, died peacefully in his sleep like an old man should. But his last words were of his debt to your family. His final command to me was to fulfill the vow he had made in this valley 16 years ago. The Apache leader straightened to his full, imposing height, and for the first time, she could see him not as an individual, but as the representative of an entire people. The living embodiment of promises made and obligations accepted. "I have come not to take a bride through force or cunning," he said with formal dignity that invested his words with the weight of ceremony. "I have come to honor my father's word, to offer you the protection of my name and the strength of my people to finally repay a debt that has been carried in Apache hearts for 16 years. By joining with me, you seal the bond your father forged with his compassion. You ensure that this land will be protected by the Chiricahua people for all the generations yet to come. You become not a captive, but a queen, not a servant, but the heart of a great lodge." Cora sank down onto the steps of her porch, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Her entire life, her entire understanding of her place in the world, had been turned upside down in the space of a few minutes. Her father wasn't just a simple homesteader who had died of fever. He was a man who, with a single act of compassion and courage, had bound his daughter's destiny to that of one of the greatest Apache chiefs in history. She looked at Gotchiman with new eyes, seeing him clearly for the first time. He wasn't a suitor seeking a wife through force or desperation. He was the son of a king, fulfilling the most sacred obligation that could exist between men. The hand he offered wasn't just a proposal of marriage, but the closing of a circle that had begun long ago with an act of kindness in the wilderness. A demonstration that honor and loyalty could transcend the boundaries of race culture and the bitter hatreds that divided their peoples. The choice before her was suddenly infinitely larger and more significant than she had ever imagined. It wasn't about her loneliness or her fear, wasn't about survival or security or any of the small personal concerns that had dominated her thinking. It was about legacy and honor, about debts that could only be paid by the joining of two worlds, about the possibility that love and understanding could bridge even the deepest cultural divides. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, Cora Abernathy realized that her life was no longer her own to control. It belonged, and had always belonged, to forces larger than herself, to promises made before her birth, to obligations that transcended individual desire, to a destiny that had been written in blood and sealed with honor in this very valley 16 years ago. The revelation left Cora in a state of emotional turmoil that made sleep impossible and concentration a distant memory. She spent the following day moving through her routine chores like a woman walking in her sleep, her hands performing familiar tasks, while her mind reeled from the implications of Gotchiman's story. Every detail of her childhood took on new significance in light of what she now knew. The way her father would sometimes stand at the edge of their valley, staring toward the mountains with an expression she had never understood. Was he thinking of the promise he had made, wondering when it would come to claim his daughter? The careful way her mother had taught her to manage the household, to cook and sew and perform a dozen domestic skills that seemed unnecessary for a woman living alone, had she been preparing her daughter for a life among people she would never meet. Most disturbing of all was the growing realization that her survival through 15 years of solitude might not have been due entirely to her own skill and determination. How many times had potential threats simply vanished from her valley without explanation? How many dangerous men had approached her spring, only to disappear into the desert, never to be seen again? Had Apache warriors been watching over her all these years, invisible guardians, ensuring that Cochise's promise was kept? The weight of obligation pressed down on her like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to survive, and even thrive without assistance from anyone. Now she discovered that her entire existence had been shaped by forces beyond her knowledge or control, that she was not the self-made woman she had believed herself to be, but rather the beneficiary of protection she had never known existed. Her turmoil, however, was about to be violently interrupted by forces that cared nothing for Apache honor or 16-year-old promises. In Redemption Gulch, Sheriff Kane's dismissive treatment of Cora's story had been exactly what Sterling Croft needed to set his own plans in motion. The rancher had been coveting the Abernathy Spring for years, watching with growing frustration as his offers were repeatedly rejected by a woman who seemed determined to deny him the water rights that would make his ranch the most powerful operation in the territory. Croft was a man who had built his fortune through a combination of legitimate business acumen and less savory methods that included intimidation, violence, and the careful corruption of local officials. He had not achieved his current position by accepting defeat gracefully or allowing obstacles to remain in his path indefinitely. The story of 7 Apache warriors camped on Cora's land, whether true or not, provided him with the perfect opportunity to eliminate the problems she represented, while appearing to be motivated by civic duty and concern for public safety. He began spreading an embellished version of her account throughout the saloon, adding details that transformed her story from a bizarre marriage proposal into a tale of savage warriors holding a helpless white woman captive. In Croft's version, the Apache had been terrorizing Cora for weeks, stealing her livestock, threatening her life, and preventing her from leaving her property. They were clearly the advance guard of a larger war party scouts, preparing the way for raids that would devastate the entire region. Any decent man had a moral obligation to rescue the poor woman and eliminate the threat before it could spread. He found fertile ground for his lies among the rougher elements of Redemption. Gulch men whose prejudices ran deep and whose capacity for violence was held in check only by the lack of socially acceptable targets. With promises of whiskey money and the tacit approval of respectable society, he quickly assembled a posse of a dozen men who were less concerned with law and order than with the opportunity for sanctioned bloodshed. These were not the solid citizens who might have asked inconvenient questions about evidence or legal procedure. They were hard cases and drifters, failed prospectors, and petty criminals. Men whose lives had been marked by failure and disappointment, and who welcomed any chance to take out their frustrations on acceptable targets. Several had military experience, but they were the kind of soldiers who had been discharged for cause rather than completing honorable service. Sheriff Kane, faced with mounting pressure from Croft, and his allies chose the path of bureaucratic cowardice. He declared the situation a civil matter. Outside his jurisdiction, busied himself with paperwork that kept him confined to his office, and made it clear that he would not interfere with any citizen action taken to resolve the crisis. The fix was in, the stage was set, and Sterling Croft had all the legal cover he needed to commit murder under the guise of public service. As dusk fell on the day after Gotchiman's revelation, Croft and his hired killers rode out of Redemption Gulch with their weapons cleaned and loaded their canteens filled with whiskey instead of water. and their minds fixed on violence that would solve all of Croft's problems while satisfying their own need for blood. Their plan was brutally simple, ride, and fast and hard, kill the Apache under the pretext of rescuing Cora, and then convince the grateful woman to sell her land for whatever price Croft chose to offer. If she proved insufficiently grateful or attempted to interfere with their version of events, they would deal with her as well, claiming she had been killed in the crossfire or driven mad by her ordeal. It was foolproof, profitable, and completely legal under the prevailing attitudes of territorial law. What could possibly go wrong? Cora was sitting on her porch in the gathering darkness, still struggling to process the implications of Gotchamin's story, when she heard the sound that chilled her blood and the heavy, clumsy drumming of shod horses moving too fast through terrain that demanded caution and respect. It was not the purposeful advance of a military patrol or the careful approach of legitimate travelers, but the reckless charge of men whose judgment had been compromised by alcohol and bloodlust. She grabbed her rifle and moved to the corner of her porch where the cabin wall would provide some protection, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to count the approaching riders by their hoofbeats. Too many to fight, too many to escape, too many to survive if they came with hostile intent. From the Apache camp came a sharp, low whistle that cut through the night air like a blade, a signal that was answered immediately by similar sounds from different directions. Gotchamin and his warriors had heard the approaching threat, and they were already moving to meet it with the silent efficiency that had made them legends throughout the Southwest. Gotchamin himself appeared at her side, with supernatural swiftness, materializing from the darkness like a ghost given solid form. "Get inside," he hissed urgently, his massive hand closing briefly on her shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and commanding. "Bar the door and stay low. These men do not come in peace, they ride with whiskey courage and murder in their hearts." "Who are they?" Cora asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The man from town." Gotchamin replied grimly, his dark eyes scanning the darkness for threats and opportunities. "The one who covets your water and hates your independence. He comes with hired killers to take what he cannot buy and silence the witness who might expose his crimes." There was no time for further explanation. The sound of approaching horses was growing louder, accompanied now by voices lifted in drunken bravado, and the metallic rattle of weapons being readied for use. Cora retreated into her cabin and dropped the heavy bar across the door, but she didn't retreat to the back room as Gotchamin had suggested. Instead, she took position at the window where she could see what was happening, and if necessary, add her rifle to whatever defense the Apache mounted. Through the crack in her shutter, she watched 7 shadows melt into the rocks and brush that dotted her valley, becoming invisible with a speed and skill that seemed almost supernatural. They were no longer the patient, dignified visitors who had shared her hospitality. They were warriors of the Chiricahua predators, returning to their natural element, death incarnate, preparing to meet death. The posse thundered into her valley like a cavalry charge, a disorderly mob of men who made no attempt at stealth or tactical coordination. They were led by Sterling Croft, whose fine clothes and expensive horse marked him as clearly as a uniform, followed by a collection of hard-faced men whose weapons glinted in the starlight like the fangs of approaching wolves. "All right, you savages," Croft bellowed as he pulled his lathered horse to a halt in the center of her yard. His voice slurred with drink and thick with anticipated triumph. "The party's over. Release the woman and ride out of here, and we might let you live long enough to reach the border." His men spread out in a rough semicircle, their rifles and pistols trained on the shadows where they thought the Apache might be hiding. They were confident in their numbers and firepower, secure in the knowledge that they represented civilization confronting savagery, law and order, triumphing over barbarism. They had no idea that they were facing some of the finest warriors who had ever lived, men who had spent their entire adult lives perfecting the art of warfare in terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. They were about to receive an education in the difference between drunken courage and professional competence, between mob violence and surgical precision. Now this is my land. Cora shouted from behind her barricaded door, her voice ringing with authority that surprised even her. You're the ones trespassing. Get out before someone gets hurt. Croft laughed harshly, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like the bay of a hunting hound. Playing along with them, little lady. Don't you worry, we'll have you safe and sound before morning. Just stay down and let the men handle this. He raised his rifle toward the shadows, where he thought the Apache were hiding, the barrel weaving slightly as the whiskey in his system affected his coordination. Last chance, heathens, come out with your hands up, or we'll smoke you out. The first shot came not from the Apache positions, not from Cora's rifle, but from one of Croft's own men, a trigger-happy drunk who fired wildly at a shadow. That might have been a warrior, or might have been a wind-blown bush. The bullet splintered the wooden frame of Cora's window, sending splinters flying like shrapnel and nearly taking her head off in the process. That was the end of negotiation, the end of restraint, the end of any possibility that the situation might be resolved without bloodshed. The world exploded in a symphony of gunfire that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireflies, the crack and boom of rifles and pistols echoing off the canyon walls in a continuous thunder that made coherent thought impossible. But there was a fundamental difference between the two sides that became apparent within seconds of the first shot. Croft's men were firing wildly, spraying bullets in every direction without taking time to aim or identify targets. They were fighting fear and shadows, wasting ammunition on phantoms while real threats moved among them like death itself. The Apache, by contrast, fired with surgical precision that spoke of years of training and bitter experience. Every shot was carefully aimed, every bullet intended for a specific target, every trigger pull the result of calm calculation rather than panicked reaction. They fired and moved, their positions constantly shifting so that return fire struck empty air, while their own rounds found flesh and bone with devastating accuracy. 2 of Croft's men were down within the first 30 seconds, their screams adding to the cacophony of violence as they writhed in the dirt with shattered limbs and punctured organs. A third was trying to reload his rifle with hands that shook so badly he kept dropping cartridges, his nerve broken by the realization that he was facing professional killers rather than the easy targets he had expected. Cora, reacting on instincts honed by 15 years of survival in hostile territory, pushed her rifle barrel through the gap in her shutter and began adding her own fire to the battle. The familiar weight of the weapon steadied her nerves, the routine of aiming and firing, providing an anchor of normalcy in the chaos surrounding her. Her first shot took one of the attackers in the chest, the heavy 45-70 round spinning him from his saddle like a broken doll. She worked the lever action smoothly, chambering another round, and shifted her aim to the next target. She wasn't just defending her home anymore. She was fighting alongside men who had come to honor her, standing with warriors who valued her safety above their own lives. Gotchaman himself had taken position on a low ridge that commanded the entire battlefield, his rifle speaking with methodical precision as he directed his men with hand signals and whistled commands. He wasn't taking cover like his warriors. He stood upright in full view of the enemy, drawing their fire to himself, while his men maneuvered for killing shots. It was leadership of the highest order, the kind of courage that inspired men to follow their chief into hell itself. He was protecting not just Cora, but the sacred honor of his people, defending promises made by his father, and the integrity of Apache law that decreed this woman and this land were under tribal protection. The firefight was brutal, chaotic, and mercifully brief. Croft's men had been expecting easy slaughter, not professional resistance from disciplined enemies who knew every rock and bush in the terrain they were defending. Faced with accurate fire from multiple directions, watching their companions fall with terrifying regularity, their whiskey-fueled courage evaporated like morning dew under the desert sun. Within minutes, half of the attackers were dead or wounded, their blood soaking into the red dirt of Cora's valley. The survivors broke and fled, spurring their horses toward the perceived safety of town, while abandoning their fallen comrades without a backward glance. They had learned the difference between murder and warfare, between victimizing the helpless and facing warriors who could fight back. Sterling Croft found himself alone in the aftermath, his expensive horse shot from under him, scrambling behind the dead animal's body for protection, while fumbling to reload his pistol with hands that shook like autumn leaves. His fine clothes were torn and stained with dirt and blood, his carefully cultivated image of civilized authority reduced to the pathetic scrambling of a coward who had led better men to their deaths. Silence fell over the valley like a curtain broken only by the groans of the wounded and the nervous whinnying of terrified horses. Smoke hung in the air like morning fog carrying the acrid smell of gunpowder and the copper tang of blood. The battle was over, decided in favor of discipline and skill over numbers and drunken bravado. Cora stepped from her cabin rifle still in her hands and surveyed the carnage that had transformed her peaceful valley into a battlefield. 7 Apache warriors emerged from the shadows, like ghosts materializing at dawn and their weapons ready, but their immediate purpose accomplished. They moved among the fallen with professional efficiency, checking for signs of life, collecting weapons, and ensuring that no threats remained. Gotchaiman approached Sterling Croft's hiding place with the patient steps of a predator closing in for the kill. The rancher looked up from behind his makeshift barricade and found himself staring into dark eyes that held no mercy, no compromise, no possibility of negotiation. "Please," Croft whispered, his voice cracking with terror as he realized that all his schemes and bribes and political connections meant nothing in the face of Apache justice. "I have money. I can pay you. We can make a deal." Gotchaiman studied him with the dispassionate interest of a scientist examining an interesting but ultimately insignificant specimen. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You came to my woman's land with murder in your heart," he said quietly. "You brought killers and whiskey courage to steal what you could not buy, to take by force what was never yours to claim. You have violated the sacred protection that my people extend to this place and this woman." Croft tried to speak, to offer more bribes or excuses or appeals to mercy, but Gotchaiman silenced him with a gesture that left no room for argument. "You will live," the Apache chief continued, "because killing you would bring more trouble than you are worth. But you will remember this night for whatever days remain to you, and you will carry the knowledge that you are alive only because Apache honor values justice over revenge." Gotchaiman and his warriors took Croft's weapons, his boots, and his money, leaving him with nothing but a single canteen of water and the clothes on his back. It was a sentence that would have been incomprehensible to white law, but was perfectly proportioned by Apache standards, harsh enough to ensure he would never again threaten their protected territory, but merciful enough to avoid the cycle of vengeance that his death would have triggered. "Well, walk back to your town," Gotchaiman commanded, his voice carrying the finality of absolute authority. "Tell your sheriff and your judge and your newspaper what happened here tonight. Tell them that the Abernathy land is under the protection of the Chiricahua people, and that anyone who rides against this woman again will be considered an enemy of our entire nation. There will be no warning next time, no mercy for those who would harm what we have sworn to protect." They watched as Croft stumbled off into the darkness, a broken man whose schemes had collapsed around him like a house built on sand. He was no longer a threat, no longer even an annoyance, just another casualty of the war between greed and honor, between corruption and justice, between those who took and those who gave. By dawn, word of the battle had reached Redemption Gulch, carried by the survivors who had fled the valley in terror and panic. The story grew, in the telling transformed from a failed robbery attempt into an epic clash between civilization and savagery. But the essential facts remained unchanged. Sterling Croft's hired killers had been defeated, his schemes exposed, and his power broken beyond repair. Sheriff Kane faced with evidence he could no longer ignore, and political pressure he could no longer deflect, was forced to organize an official response. But when his reluctant posse rode into Cora's valley the following morning, and they found not the scene of massacre and captivity they had expected, but something that challenged every assumption they had made about the situation. Cora Abernathy sat calmly on her porch, sipping coffee from a tin cup and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Gutchaman stood nearby, his rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm, his expression neutral but alert. The bodies of Croft's men had been gathered respectfully and covered with blankets, treated with more dignity in death than they had shown in life. "Miss Abernathy." Sheriff Kane began uncertainly, his voice betraying the confusion and embarrassment he felt at having to confront a situation that made a mockery of everything he thought he understood about law and order in his territory. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm perfectly fine, Sheriff." Cora replied with calm authority that seemed to transform her from victim to judge in the space of a single sentence. "Though I'm afraid I can't say the same for Mr. Croft's associates. They made the mistake of attacking my home and threatening my guests." She used the word guests, deliberately investing it with significance that was impossible to miss. The implication was clear. These Apache warriors were not her captors, but her allies, not her enemies, but her chosen protectors. "Croft claimed you were being held hostage," Kane said weakly, trying to salvage some shred of authority from the wreckage of his assumptions. "Does it look like I'm being held hostage, Sheriff?" Cora asked, raising an eyebrow, with an expression that mixed amusement with contempt. She stood and walked to stand beside Gutchaman, presenting a united front that left no doubt about where her loyalties lay. "Sterling Croft is a liar and a thief who tried to murder me for my land. He brought hired killers to my home, fired on my property, and would have killed me along with my friends if they hadn't been here to protect me." Sheriff Kane looked around at the evidence, at the quiet dignity of the Apache warriors, at the defensive positioning of the bodies that told the story of an attack repelled rather than an assault launched, at the calm confidence of a woman who was clearly in control of her own fate. He knew he was facing a situation that was beyond his ability to handle through normal legal channels. These Apache warriors could disappear into the mountains at will, taking Cora with them if they chose. And no force at his disposal could hope to track them through terrain they knew better than the lines on their own palms. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that he had been played for a fool by Sterling Croft, manipulated into providing legal cover for what was essentially an attempted murder, motivated by greed and personal spite. The political implications alone were enough to end his career if the story became widely known. "I see," he said finally, his tone suggesting anything but understanding. We'll take care of the bodies, and I'll need to have words with Mr. Croft about filing false reports." Everyone present knew that Croft's power in the territory was broken beyond repair. His hired killers were dead or fled, his reputation was destroyed, and his schemes were exposed for all to see. He would be lucky to avoid prison, luckier still to avoid the vengeance of families whose sons and brothers had died for his ambitions. After the sheriff and his men departed with their grim cargo, a new kind of silence settled over Cora's valley. It wasn't the oppressive quiet of isolation or the tense stillness of impending violence, but the peaceful hush of a place where justice had been served and honor had been satisfied. Gutchaman approached her slowly, his dark eyes searching her face for some sign of how the night's events had affected her understanding of the choice before her. There was blood on his shirt from a minor wound, evidence that he had risked his own life to protect her, but his expression was as calm and patient as ever. "My father's oath has been fulfilled," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that spoke of duties completed and promises kept. "The debt of blood has been paid in full. You are safe, your land is protected, and your enemies have been scattered like leaves before the wind. If you wish us to leave now, we will go with honor intact and obligation satisfied." He was offering her a final choice. She realized, a decision made free from the pressure of immediate danger or the weight of unfulfilled obligations. She could send them away and return to her solitary existence, secure in the knowledge that Apache protection would shield her from future threats, but otherwise unchanged by their brief presence in her life. Or she could step forward into an unknown future, accepting the hand that had been offered in marriage and the life that came with it. Cora looked around at her small cabin, her struggling garden, the familiar lines of mountains that had been her horizon for 22 years. It had been her world, her fortress, her prison. It was home, but it was also a cage, and she was finally ready to admit that the bars were of her own making. "You came here to ask for my hand in marriage," she said, her voice clear and strong in the morning stillness. "You've waited patiently for my answer, protected me from my enemies, and honored me with your presence. But you've never actually heard my response." Gotchaman waited, his expression neutral, but his eyes holding a hope he was too proud to voice. A slow smile spread across Cora's weathered features, transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. It was the first real smile she had worn in 15 years, the first expression of pure joy that had touched her lips since childhood. "The answer is yes," she said simply. It was not the ending anyone could have predicted, not the townspeople of Redemption Gulch, not Sterling Croft, rotting in territorial prison for conspiracy and attempted murder, and certainly not Cora Abernathy herself when she had first seen 7 shadows fall across her land. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, conducted according to both Apache and Christian traditions in the valley, where her father had saved a chief and where she had found her destiny. It was a ceremony that bridged 2 worlds, witnessed by warriors and settlers alike, blessed by the spring that had made it all possible, and sanctified by the mountains that had kept their secrets for so long. Cora didn't leave her valley immediately. There were arrangements to be made, treaties to be honored, and a new life to be carefully constructed from the foundations of 2 very different cultures. She learned the Apache language while teaching English to young warriors, shared the agricultural techniques her father had taught her while learning the ancient wisdom of a people who had survived in the harshest environments on Earth for countless generations. Her life became one of movement between worlds, spending summers in the cool heights of the Sierra Madre with Gotchaman's people, and winters in the valley that would always be home. She bore 4 children, who grew up trilingual, equally comfortable with Apache war chants and Christian hymns with the democratic ideals of American civilization and the clan loyalties that governed tribal society. The Abernathy Spring never ran dry, protected by treaties signed in blood and honored by both cultures. The valley became a neutral ground where disputes could be settled and agreements reached, a bridge between worlds that demonstrated what was possible when honor met courage and ancient promises were kept in full. Sterling Croft never returned to Arizona territory. Broken by imprisonment and financial ruin, he died forgotten and unmourned in a California mining camp, a cautionary tale of what happened when greed overreached honor and when civilized men forgot the difference between law and justice. Sheriff Kane found his courage after the Valley fight, becoming the kind of lawman the territory needed, one who understood that justice wasn't always found in legal codes, but sometimes in the ancient principles that governed interactions between honorable people. He served with distinction until his retirement, earning the respect of both cultures and the gratitude of citizens who benefited from his hard-won wisdom. And in the desert evenings when the sun painted the Dragoon Mountains in shades of fire, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Cora would sometimes stand where she had first drawn that line in the dirt, the boundary that had seemed so important and so meaningless now, in light of all that had followed. She would think of her father and the kindness that echoed across generations of the debt, paid not in gold or blood, but in love and loyalty, and the joining of hearts that had always been meant to find each other. She would remember the girl who had stood alone against the world, and the woman who had chosen to embrace a future she could never have imagined. The lone woman of the valley was alone no more. She was the heart of 2 peoples, the bridge between two legacies, the living proof that honor was the truest currency and love the most powerful force in any wilderness, tamed or wild. Her story became legend among both Apache and settler, told around campfires, and in lodge circles passed down through generations as testament to the truth that destiny sometimes arrived on horseback, that the deepest solitude could be broken by the most unexpected love, and that the greatest courage lay not in standing alone, but in having the strength to embrace a future that transcended all boundaries. In a land where violence was common and mercy was rare, where cultures clashed and civilizations ground against each other like continental plates, the marriage of Cora Abernathy and Goat Cheeman stood as proof that another way was possible, that understanding could triumph over hatred, that honor could bridge any divide, and that love, when it was built on foundations of respect and sacrifice, could overcome any obstacle that human prejudice or natural hardship could devise.